Mr. Webb, a new business partner, arrives at a mansion to discuss matters of their mutual business with Mr. Brown, a powerful man owning the mansion. Things start becoming more menacing after Mr. Brown is revealed to have an owl head, with the guests and the butler explaining that they have been trapped for months, not knowing for what reason. Hi folks, I'm R, your narrator, and welcome to the video. Send me your short movie or video game suggestions on Twitter, which I can use for the upcoming videos. This video will contain spoilers. With that in mind, let's begin. Mr. Webb, a business partner, arrives at Mr. Brown's mansion, being welcomed by the butler called Declan. Mr. Webb starts feeling an eerie atmosphere as soon as he enters, being instructed by Declan to go to Mr. Brown's office where he's waiting for him. Dressed in a similar outfit, Mr. Brown is seen to be transparent, as if morphing into a certain shape. As soon as Mr. Webb initiates a conversation with him, he comes into full opacity, having a distinct owl head, which takes Mr. Webb by surprise.
Mr. Brown?
Nice to meet you, Mr. Webb.
But you...
Did you have a nice arrival?
Mr. Brown, being polite and showing remarkable hospitality, welcomes Mr. Webb in a menacing tone, cutting him off just when he's about to express his concern that Mr. Brown has an owl head. As Mr. Webb tries to indirectly point out his concerns, asking if Mr. Brown is okay, he dismisses his questions and tries to make Mr. Webb stay longer in the mansion, postponing the business discussions until after dinner.
Are you... okay?
I'm fine, thank you. You look hungry, though. Business can wait until tomorrow.
Well...
But before we eat, you have to meet the other guests.
Mr. Brown then proceeds to introduce the other guests in the mansion, who are some unlikely guests to be present. April Merritt, a young mother, and Josie, her young daughter, who don't seem to be in business with Mr. Brown, nor acquainted to him in any other way. As Mr. Webb tries desperately to point out Mr. Brown is an owl, he yet again gets interrupted.
Guys! What's going on here?
Let's have dinner.
After the introduction, Mr. Webb has enough and shouts to what is going on, with no one seemingly seeing the supernatural appearance of Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown then instructs everyone to have dinner, completely dismissing Mr. Webb's concerns. After some time at the dinner table, April and Josie unconvincingly and pretentiously praise the food just to please Mr. Brown, with Declan having it cooked.
Delicious. Isn't it, April?
Declan really surpassed himself.
Yummy.
What do you think, Mr. Webb?
Mr. Webb, having enough of the pretense and the extremely bizarre encounter and experience he's having, yet again tries to ask why Mr. Brown is an owl, this time April cutting him off before he finishes his sentence. Mr. Brown then instructs Mr. Webb to go to his room and rest, with them working on business tomorrow. April then subsequently excuses herself and mentions she will show Mr. Webb his room, with Mr. Brown giving her a stern glare.
I'm more interested in why you are an owl.
So, everyone finished?
Yes, Mum.
I will guide Mr. Webb to his room then.
All right.
Should I stay here? With Mr. Brown?
I'll be right back, okay?
We'll see each other tomorrow. Just come to my office when you're ready. We've got a lot of work to do.
As they leave Mr. Brown's presence, April explains that they don't mention he's an owl, as before he showed aggression and became violent when confronted with the facts. April then continues that they don't know if they can trust Declan, something Mr. Webb should try and find out. She further continues that they have been kept prisoners in the mansion for even months maybe, with her losing the concept of time. Mr. Webb, having heard enough, informs April that they can just leave, taking Josie with them, when April mentions that he underestimates him, seemingly he being much more powerful beyond Mr. Webb's human understanding. April then proceeds to whisper that he lurks in the dark and eavesdrops on their conversations, and that he even possibly poisoned the tap water, with the only way to escape him being to kill him, before Mr. Webb also falls under his supernatural spell, seemingly derived from the cosmos. As day 2 begins, Mr. Webb enters Mr. Brown's office and hands over the contracts to enter the business discussions. After some time, being satisfied with the day's progress, Mr. Brown instructs Mr. Webb to get ready for dinner, as they can get back to work tomorrow from where they stopped. As Mr. Brown plans to leave, he then notices Mr. Brown's telescope. Mr. Brown explains that he often finds it difficult to fall asleep at night when he observes the stars instead, an indication of where he might have come from.
I often can't find any sleep at night. Then I like to observe the stars through my telescope.
As Mr. Webb subsequently leaves the office, he witnesses Declan waiting outside by the entry door. He engages in a conversation, starting by small talk. After asking for a suggestion for drinks, Declan strictly advises Mr. Webb not to drink the tap water, dismissing it as not having good quality. This confirms April's theory that the water has been poisoned by Mr. Brown. Mr. Webb then soon discovers that Declan, just like April and Josie, have also fallen under Mr. Brown's spell, being a prisoner not able to leave, something he desires desperately.
What do you recommend to drink?
We've got a decent selection of red wine. Just don't drink the tap water.
Why shouldn't I?
Well, the water in this area is a bit limey.
Do you think about leaving this house?
It's not that easy.
I will take care of it.
Mr. Webb then asks Declan for a weapon in order to neutralize Mr. Brown, to which Declan promises to provide him with knives from the kitchen. At dinner, with April, Josie, Mr. Brown and Mr. Webb present, they have some small talk about business, both having underlying messages about how their disagreements will soon be resolved. With Mr. Webb having the murder of Mr. Brown in mind, and Mr. Brown having the idea of putting Mr. Webb under his spell.
Mr. Webb is a tough negotiating partner, but I'm confident that we can conclude an agreement.
We'll find a solution for our problem soon.
Outside the dining room, Mr. Webb reassures April not to worry, as he will sort it out, when April mentions that she's afraid that it's going to be too late already. As day 3 commences with Mr. Webb exploring the premises, he gets caught by Mr. Brown, who appears from thin air. Mr. Brown, knowing what Mr. Webb is up to, informs him that whatever he's planning won't work, and orders Declan to go to his room, where he seemingly punishes him. Mr. Brown then subsequently disappears when Declan hands a knife over to Mr. Webb, mentioning that he hopes it would work. A horrifying fact that Mr. Webb will soon unveil. Mr. Webb then proceeds to go to Mr. Brown's office, where he repeatedly stabs him to death, uttering in disbelief that he's dead.
He's dead.
As the guests gather in the hallway to find out about the outcome, Mr. Webb instructs the guests that they can finally leave, with Mr. Brown being dead. Josie asks her mother April if they can truly leave, when April in defeat mentions that it's already too late for Mr. Webb. That's when the horrifying mystery is unveiled, with Mr. Webb transforming into Mr. Brown, with his head being replaced with an owl head. Declan, horrified to the outcome, drops to his knees saying not again and that he's thirsty. Mr. Webb, now being transformed into Mr. Brown, repeats the same word Mr. Brown used to say, instructing the guests to have dinner with the same menacing tone.
Let's have dinner.
This reveals that this wasn't in fact the first time that this happened, with more business partners trying to neutralize Mr. Brown before, but ultimately failing and being taken over by this cosmic supernatural presence. Declan also explains that he's thirsty, revealing that they haven't been drinking water as it's truly poisoned, with them seemingly drinking other beverages to satiate their thirst, such as wine. It's unclear why Mr. Brown poisoned the water, maybe to put his subjects under more of his control, or even maybe as a form of punishment. As it's clearly depicted, Mr. Brown displayed violent tendencies before, and even frequently punishing Declan. It seems as if Mr. Brown is a cosmic entity able to manipulate aspects of space and time and take over his assailant's bodies after his physical body is harmed past the point of repair. More mysteries remain to whom Mr. Brown or the owl entity truly is, what he wants, and how he could actually be neutralized. As day 4 begins, a man called Mr. Riley, being identical to his predecessor, Mr. Webb, arrives at the mansion, with Declan welcoming him in the same fashion as before, as if this nightmare is a never-ending and repeating loop.
Welcome, Mr. Riley. Mr. Webb is already awaiting you. You will find him in his office, down the hallway.
Thank you.
Have a pleasant stay, sir.
Mr. Riley is then instructed to go to Mr. Brown's office, but this time, Declan refers to him as Mr. Webb, as appropriately, the owl entity took over the existence, life and the body of Mr. Webb, therefore, he became him. This suggests that the real Mr. Brown was no other than another guest who tried to neutralize the owl entity, but ultimately failed, having his body taken and possessed by the owl entity to compensate for his own body. The question remains to when was the very first encounter and business partner who entered the mansion, and whose body the owl entity possessed before possessing the business partners. And lastly, why do the business partners look identical to each other? Why do they keep coming to the mansion for the same purpose? Mr. Riley enters Mr. Webb's office, and in an almost identical manner, the owl entity fully takes over Mr. Webb's body, morphing into a final shape, gaining full opacity. Instead of even talking about the business, Mr. Webb, who is now taken by the owl entity, instructs Mr. Riley to have dinner with him, but before, to meet the other guests.
Let's have dinner.
After a quick introduction, they sit at the dinner table and enjoy the food. This time, Mr. Riley doesn't raise the question to why Mr. Webb has an owl head, and instead decides to go to bed as he's tired. Outside the dining room, April has the same conversation with him as she had with his predecessor before, with the day subsequently coming to an end. The next day, Mr. Riley hands over the contracts to Mr. Webb, going over the business arrangements. As Mr. Riley leaves the office to the hallway, Mr. Webb appears from thin air and sings a funny yet menacing song, which unveils a lot of information about the mysteries lurking in this mansion.
Voices in my head, they scream in the name of a long forgotten past. They're threatening me. This shell is built to last. Hear me out, this ain't over soon. Day in and day out we feast at noon. The final contract might get you out. Go figure what it's about. If I can leave, then you can too. No men, no women, no innocent daughter. They'll have to see this through. It may have started out with a sip of the water. Another day, another night, another sip, another bite. I can feel the many feet marching out as I'm complete. It's getting worse, the feeling inside. Got nowhere to run, no place to hide. And I can feel the many feet marching out as I'm complete.
It seems as if the song is sang from the combination of both the owl entity and the real Mr. Webb. He indicates that he's trying to complete his final form. He further indicates that the voices in his head, presumably from his previous victims, talk about their forgotten lives. He finally indicates that it all might have started with a sip of water, revealing that the water was intentionally poisoned by him in order to take control of the certain people whom he trapped in this mansion and took over. The events then play out just like before, with Mr. Riley planning Mr. Webb's murder, asking Declan for a weapon. After dinner, Mr. Riley takes a knife from Declan and proceeds to kill Mr. Webb. After repeatedly stabbing Mr. Webb and believing yet again that he's dead, he goes to the hallway and observes the other guests waiting, with April in defeat repeating the same lines that it's already too late for Mr. Riley. Subsequently, the owl entity takes over Mr. Riley's body, instructing everyone to have dinner.
Let's have dinner.
The next day begins with a new business partner called Mr. Chambers entering the mansion. This time, the entire mansion is mirrored, with Mr. Chambers mentioning that this place looks familiar, as if he somehow experienced the previous events before, connecting to why the business partners all look the same, and enter the premises with the same intentions.
This place looks strangely familiar.
This time, the owl entity is referred to as Mr. Riley, having taken over the previous business partner. The events yet again play out the same, with Declan mentioning whoever stays in the mansion for longer than a few hours fall under the owl entity's spell.
My master possesses the people inside this house. Everyone who stays here longer than a few hours falls under his spell.
A spell that traps them in the mansion to play the game of the owl entity. Declan then continues explaining that it would already be too late for Mr. Chambers to survive, with the only way to get rid of the owl entity, which Declan seems unsure to address as a man, is to neutralize him as soon as the new guest arrives. As if even a few hours pass, the new guest would be under the control of the entity.
Meet me tomorrow at this place. But hear my words. It may already be too late for you to survive this situation. The only way to stop this man would be if he was killed by someone who just arrived at this house. We have to eat dinner now.
After dinner, Mr. Chambers this time asks Declan for a second knife, which he stuffs in the umbrella holder. He then subsequently proceeds as his predecessors before him, stabbing Mr. Riley to death. Yet again, the owl entity takes over Mr. Chambers' body, with the day coming to an end.
Oh, not again! Oh, I'm so thirsty.
Let's have dinner.
A new business partner soon arrives called Mr. Dawson, who gets instructed by Declan to meet the owl entity, now called Mr. Chambers, in his office. Unlike the rest of the business partners before, Mr. Dawson checks the umbrella holder, where he finds a knife. He takes the knife with him and quickly stabs Mr. Chambers before he gains his full opacity, killing him as soon as he arrives in the mansion, seemingly lifting the curse. As Mr. Dawson exits the office, April in surprise reassures her daughter Josie that they can finally leave, with the unknown creature not being able to detain them any longer. April continues that they will leave this nightmare and will never come back, while they all turn around and stare at the player through the screen. The owl demon-like entity was never explained to what it was and what it wanted, but it's likely that it possessed interdimensional powers controlling aspects of time and space, and the people who spent time in his mansion. He seemed to want to have subjects under his control and act like a human being while visibly having an owl head. It seems as if he didn't want to be confronted being an out-of-this-world entity, hence why he became violent if confronted. It's unclear how he initially trapped the guests, but seemingly he came in contact with them after he had already hijacked someone else's body, possibly giving them poisoned water and getting rid of anyone who didn't fit his narrative, as the mansion seems a little too big just for 4 people. The business partner, on the other hand, seems to be a perfectly sculpted character for the owl's intentions. But how does the owl entity have control outside of the mansion in order to manipulate a person to come into the premises that he dwells within? And why do they all look the same? The answer could lie in the very ending, when all of the guests and characters look directly at the players.
Can we really leave now, Mummy?
Yes, my dear. This creature won't detain us any longer. We'll leave this nightmare and never look back.
The owl entity was an unexplained, unknown created villain who controlled the guests. It seems as if he was created by a higher power to create the conundrum the guests have found themselves within. The higher power in here, in fact, is no other than the players who play with the lives of the sentient characters just for the sake of entertainment. They're trapped in a never-ending loop to suffer an eternity without any hope or life of their own. They are completely out of place and unlikely characters to be in the mansion, April with an antique early 20th century attire, while the business partner is dressed in modern suit. They are all designed to be under the control of the players, to be subjected an eternity in a nightmarish loop. The characters at the end think that they might be able to leave the mansion, but in fact, they never will, as that's what they are destined for. They are entirely designed to suffer in this never-ending nightmare. What a game and a story. I feel like a bad person now. But the beautiful soundtrack and the very intriguing characters want me to torment them just a little bit more. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to stay tuned by hitting the subscribe button and the notification bell. It's been your host Dar, and I will see you on the next one.